joining us for one of the last sessions of NACW, and thanks for sticking with it. We are going to have a fascinating conversation today, and I hope that the cool air in here keeps everyone awake after lunch. It certainly feels chilly to me. And I do have to say, if you came to this panel expecting to see certain names up there and they're not on there, that is because we had a flu case, we had a family emergency, and then we had one company that couldn't come. So we had some great panelists that are friends and colleagues for many years who decided they would join us, and I'm so appreciative. But luckily at NACW, there's a wealth of knowledge among the participants here, so it was not hard to find excellent people to join in. So with that, my name's Lizzie Aldrich. I work at Anew, and Anew develops carbon offset and removal projects. We've been around since 2001. And at that time, we were known as Blue Source. We merged with a company called Element Markets, and we became Anew in 22. So I'm just thrilled to be here today and moderate this panel on the road to net zero. So as we get this started, just a couple of remarks, and I think that for this group, I would love to see, first of all, who's in the audience. So if you could raise your hand if you are corporate, you're looking to get to net zero or have greenhouse gas reduction targets. Okay, that's awesome. That actually surprises me. I'm glad to see it. This is mainly an industry conference. How about anyone from the academic community? Government? Suppliers? Okay, intermediaries, suppliers. Developers, I think would probably fall in that category. Okay, great, good. Well, fantastic. Thanks for joining us. And today we're going to look at the barriers to getting to net zero and what corporates have experienced along the way. And all of us have worked with corporates very closely in this journey, so we're going to share some insights from having done that over the years. And I know we're in an environment now where some companies are taking steps back. Some companies are concerned with pursuing sustainability agendas as that goes right along with DEI and other programs that are getting jettisoned. And so this is a really interesting environment. It's been a challenging place all along, and now it's even more challenging. And so today we're really going to talk a lot about the types of guidelines that we have and that we need to have in order for corporates to move forward with sustainability plans that include net zero targets. And to set the stage a little bit, what I wanted to do is, I promise I don't have a lot of slides here. I just have a couple. But there has been some interesting things that have occurred in our market, and last year in 2024, SBTI, which stands for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is by far the largest set of guidelines that companies worldwide are typically trying to adhere to when they're looking for greenhouse gas reductions. This organization actually delisted 239 major companies that included Microsoft, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and Amazon. And they were delisted because they essentially timed out. They failed to meet their deadlines for validating climate targets. And when interviewed, there was actually some retrospective research done with these companies to figure out, okay, what exactly happened and why were you delisted? And 54% of the companies said that it was the Scope 3 emissions and the provisions under SBTI that required those Scope 3 emission reductions that were just too challenging for them to address. And that probably doesn't surprise most folks in this room. McKinsey estimates that 90% of a company's emissions come from Scope 3, and it is a big, challenging ball of wax to try to tackle. So that's a little just setting the stage. This is a graph from MSCI that shows over time the uptake of SBTI targets, and you can see right around 22, those targets start to, the new companies signing up to them starts to stagnate. And so we're seeing this in the number of signups. We're seeing that there is really fewer and fewer companies willing to take this on as they realize what it means and how difficult it will be to comply. Just last week, March 18th, SBTI released their second draft of a net zero standard. And this was big news for our industry. And I know a lot of us have probably spent time going through 133 pages of this draft rule. It is very much draft. There's a lot to be deciphered and determined. But just a couple of highlights about how it treats removals and offsets for those of you in the room who haven't had a chance to go through that yet. So removals credits previously in the first draft were going to be used for residual emissions in 2050 when that corporate had gotten to the end of their journey and they were at their net zero target. They could use removals for up to 10% of scope 3 and up to 5% of scope 1 and 2. In the new version, they're actually allowing corporates to use removals for up to 10% of scope 1 emissions in the ongoing years, so it's called ongoing emissions, in those years leading up to 2050. They're also thinking about having interim targets so that there would be recognition of those that did achieve the removal targets over time, and possibly setting required targets for those entities to achieve those removals procurement. So this is definitely different. There's a little context, and the devil's in the details here, and that there aren't a whole lot of SBTI companies that have signed up that have large scope 1 emissions. And that's because those are heavy industrials that realize SBTI is too restrictive. This is going to be really hard to meet. So while it may sound good that it's going to help incentivize removals industry up to 2050 and help build the industry, there are smaller pools of emissions than you may think of folks that would need to procure. There's also a question in there about the types of removals that are allowed. Should it be like for like removals, which means if you have fossil fuels as your emissions, you would need to use direct air capture or BECCS, which is biomass carbon capture and sequestration, in order to neutralize those emissions. If you have land use change, you could use forestry removals. That's pretty restricting. Or they ask in the draft, because it's in public comment and they're asking for feedback, they say, should we allow corporates to go from less permanent removals like forestry that's available on the market now and transition over time to more permanent? So those would be like tech-based removals that have 1,000-year plus permanence by 2050. So this is all on the table. The second area of this SBTI rule is the flexibility for scope 3. There's a lot more flexibility, and some medium-sized companies may not actually have to address their scope 3 emissions. And they're allowing these kind of vaguely defined in-value chain indirect mitigation actions to apply to scope 3 reductions. A lot remains to be seen as to what those activities will entail and whether or not carbon credits could play a role in that if they fell in a value chain. But they did call out specifically SAF certificates for sustainable aviation fuel, and possibly RNG certificates could fall into that too. So tradable instruments not tied to the physical commodity that would be eligible for use. And lastly, offsets. Offsets in this version, again, don't give the company any credit. They're called beyond value chain mitigation activities, and they would essentially earn a company a gold star. There's talk about giving recognition to companies that choose to purchase offsets in addition to complying with their SBTI targets. So we're going to talk about some of these today, and that's it for the slides. I'll go back to the first. Okay. So with that, I just want to ask my panel to go through and give us a quick intro. Tell us about your background in the climate industry and what you do now. Chelsea, do you want to start?
Absolutely. Chelsea Bryant. I'm the Managing Director and Head of Carbon Advisory for BMO Capital Markets. I have been in the environmental commodity space for close to 15 years now, with a majority of my time spent trading on a global basis, both compliance and voluntary markets. My role now is focused on carbon advisory services, so the perspective I'm going to bring to the panel is going to be more focused on the engagement that BMO has across a wide myriad of corporate clients, And then sprinkling in some of the anecdotal pieces from my trading experience, because I think that's particularly interesting when we're thinking about this, because it's all about how do we get to those effective commercial outcomes, because those effective commercial outcomes are going to ultimately be what drives investment into emission abatement and removal projects. And with that, I'll pass it on to my next panelist.
Thank you. So I'm Paula DePerna. I am an advisor to the Carbon Disclosure Project, which many of you know is the world's really only integrated environmental disclosure system covering climate change, water, and forest disclosure. And I'm sure many of the companies here disclose to us, and you've heard us referred to. But I'm really on this panel more because I was quite involved with Richard Sandor in setting up the Chicago Climate Exchange, which, for those of you who don't know what that was the world's first cap-and-trade system, covered all 6 gases, was voluntary to join, but mandatory once you got in, and there was a civil contract legally binding. And what's relevant here is, one, that many of the graduates of Incubex, not only me, but of CCX, not only me, but Incubex upstairs, many of the guys up there are graduates from CCX. But what's relevant here is that we did a lot of pioneering with offsets development and all the what has become the VCM, and I've got the scars, the battle scars to show. I won't show them, but I've got them. And everything that Lizzie just talked about, the confusion and the, punitive nature sometimes of what's going on, we've lived. And so I'll be, happy to bring that perspective. But hats off to all of you for sticking with it, because this is the most important thing to be doing in the world now, is figuring out how to price carbon.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Alcock. I'm Manager of Supply Chain Innovation at Verra. Most of you will know Verra is a standard-setting organization, non-profit. We set voluntary standards to aid sustainable development, incentivize impact. My background, I've been with Verra for 3 years, but my background before joining Verra was working as a consultant, really in the carbon credit space to begin with, developing methodologies and working on project development, and then increasingly moving to working with corporates on their carbon management strategies. And what I was seeing in that consulting world was companies, a lot of confusion, first of all, but also companies asking, how can we take what we've got in the carbon crediting world, the VCM world, and apply that to reducing Scope 3 emissions to meet our science-based targets. And most of you will know that's very tricky. So along came Verra 3 years ago and said, hey, we're seeing this problem too. We're even seeing companies using the VCS program, our carbon credit program, in various ways to do this. I think we need a separate Scope 3 program specifically for this purpose. So that sounded great to me. We were going to give the opportunity to solve all these problems that I was experiencing as a consultant. And so that's what I've been working on for the last 3 years at Verra, is developing a Scope 3 standard. I'm going to do a shameless plug. We've got some flyers up here, and it's out for a public consultation right now. So if you're interested, please go and take a look. So that's what I'm doing.
Great. Thanks, everyone. My first question for you is, have you personally seen a decrease in corporate commitments over the last few years, folks dropping out of even greenhouse gas commitments due to a lack of clarity or the inability to use credits and removals in those targets?
I would say that, there was, and you showed a great graph, Lizzie, there was obviously a very substantive increase in corporate commitments in a rapid period of time. So I think to expect that there's not going to be any retraction whatsoever of commitments is probably unreasonable. There will be organizations that have, substantive changes in leadership, as an example, and they can say, well, that was the old guard, I'm the new guard, and vice versa. But by and large, we haven't seen an abandonment of commitments. And so I think the biggest question is, if you look at the targets, and even you look at interim targets out to 2030, it's really important as an individual corporate entity and for us to think collectively, is it economically and technologically feasible to actually hit those targets? And so it may not be economically feasible depending on the sector, and then certainly there might not be the technology available beyond some, set of projects that can actually be put forward. And if you think about some of these really, really large scale projects, CCUS is an example, like extraordinarily large investments. And so there needs to be certain levels of certainty to see that type of capital deployed. And so I think it's really important to kind of look at that first, because this is what speaks to why the VCM is so important. In absence of those pieces, once you've gone through your own scope 1 and scope 2, the voluntary carbon market is your, economic option for having the most cost-effective way to abate. And I think more broadly, as we think about the corporate commitments, your options, again, if you're not tracking towards 2030 targets, and there are corporates that are not in that place, is you're either abandoning your targets. Again, we're not seeing that en masse. It's not necessarily palatable from an investor lens, and it's not actually palatable necessarily from a corporate brand lens either. You're going to have to revise those targets, or you're going to need to participate in the voluntary carbon market. And so if you look at actually retirement data to date, we're only scratching the surface. This is like the really tip of the iceberg in terms of the level of commitments that have been made versus what we've actually seen in terms of market participation. So it's still actually quite early days, but definitely not seeing this widespread, prolific abandonment of targets. And I don't think that we're seeing signals from corporates that that's necessarily going to be the palatable solution either.
I'd like to just jump in there. I mean, one thing that I would throw in, I mean, as a writer, I'm very interested in words, and, science and policy don't speak the same language. Certainly science and capital do not. So, when you look back to the Paris Agreement, that was an infusion of energy to address climate change. But that was a long time ago. And, energy does fail. Energy flags. And so I think we need to be thinking about this drop-off in target setting, if there's a trend that way, or even if, it's only a slight trend. It may not be deriving directly from the difficulty of the standards. So if you're in the supply and demand, buying and selling, project developers, keep an eye on a couple of things. One is the stamina of the idea of actually addressing this problem. If it was easy, we would have done it 30 years ago. And, you have to be constantly aware of what your customer is up against. And in addition to what Chelsea just said, I've noticed a trend, and you've probably read about it, chief legal officers who never paid attention to the sustainability reports, particularly because they were kind of nice to haves, for a lot of different reasons, are paying more attention now because disclosure is becoming mandatory worldwide. In many jurisdictions it already is. So once something becomes mandatory, you trigger that chief legal officer scrutiny, and their instinct is, don't say anything you don't have to say. Don't take on any commitment you don't have to make. Don't put yourself in any position where you can have what's known as legal reach-through, where if you disclose something, it opens you up to inquiry about other things. So this is also going to be squeezing the VCM at some point. And so, my advice as a transactional thinker sometimes is think of that customer and what they're up against. And, what you can do in presenting the projects that the chief legal officer can buy. Your audience is not, the marketing people per se. It is now the chief legal officer, I would argue.
For me, so in developing the Scope 3 standard program, obviously corporates are going to be the biggest buyers of the outputs of the Scope 3 standard program. So we've done a lot of engagement. I've basically spent 3 years of my life engaging with corporates, basically finding out what do they need from the Scope 3 program. Chelsea mentioned a bunch of challenges that corporates are facing, which are all material and big challenges, but I think one of the most frustrating challenges for corporates is the accounting framework, and not being able to see, and Paul, you mentioned projects as well, not being able to see a pathway between making an investment in a project and what that looks like as a claim or progress towards a science-based target. And the accounting challenges shouldn't be one of the biggest challenges that corporates are facing. We should have that figured out, and it should be streamlined. So that's what we're trying to develop in the Scope 3 standard program. And maybe I'll leave it there because I think we've got some other questions to follow on from that.
Yeah, thank you. This next question is, is guidance that doesn't include carbon credits even viable for companies to get to net zero? And how can we also get companies to act now? There have been some initiatives over the last 3 years with VCMI, which is the voluntary carbon market initiative that speaks to claims that those corporates can make in the wake of some lawsuits surrounding carbon neutrality claims that promotes action now. The new guidance through SBTI gives a gold star if you buy offsets. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Is that enough? Will that incentivize uptake of offsets now? The removals provision in the current draft, is that going to do anything? I do want to clarify, by 2050, you still can use removals for residual emissions, but looking at this draft and looking at the build up to 2050, is the 10% of scope 1 really enough to move the mark? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. What can be done to help companies act now? And is it even possible that they have a net zero target without the use of credits?
Well, Lizzie, I think you made a really great point when you talked about SBTI and who have made SBTI commitments and what their scope 1 looks like. So it's really important to think about, and I don't think we can draw the same brush on every single sector. Like, you need to look at emissions intensive industry, and at one point in my career, I worked in multiple different sectors from an industrial perspective. At another point, I've worked from like large scale project developers. So I've kind of seen it all. And now working for a financial institution, I think it's really interesting when you stop and you say, okay, what's pragmatic? I always like to take a pragmatic lens. And so, if you have a specific disclosure standard that's not necessarily being utilized by the vast majority of emissions, then are we actually going to hit our objective? So it needs to be something that is inclusive. And then the second piece, it's if you're saying, okay, can we do this without any type of use of the VCM? Well, I would encourage everyone to look at the marginal cost of abatement curve for a large industrial emitter, and then also look at the viable technology that exists today, and you tell me what you think, and where are those funds going to come from? I also like when I look back and I sit here as us individually, like ultimately it's the individual consumer that pays. Like the costs don't just materially disappear, whether it's being funded by government or it's being funded by other ways and it's flowing through into product costs. We're ultimately going to each individually pay. And so I think it's really, really important to focus on doing that from the most economically efficient perspective as possible, which is why I'm so pro-markets. You do need, and we've successfully seen the use of government, because in absence of government, oftentimes some of these very large scale investments can't be made. You can't unlock private capital into some of these very, very, very capital intensive projects. So to see technology innovation, it's great to see different types of private and public capital come to bear. But at the same time, if we're saying no use of markets, I don't think that that's in the best interests of anyone. I don't think that that's going to get us to the level of emission reductions and removals that we need in the most capital efficient way. And as things get too expensive, and I think we can all attest to this, you start to see some pretty substantive political outcry to say that it's too expensive. And people tend to become very myopically focused on, like, how do I get through today, and not necessarily thinking about 2050. So again, I think markets are a great capital efficient way to drive towards an outcome at the best price point, and that excites me.
Can I come in? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think one thing that's important to remember, though, is the whole sort of basis of company inventory accounting, particularly Scope 3 accounting, is to give companies responsibility for those emissions that they are indirectly responsible for. And so I think there needs to be probably a shift in the way that we think about and the amount of flexibility in the accounting, particularly. I'm totally focused on accounting, so I apologize if we go down that train too much. But yeah, I mean, right now this is totally focused on, what do companies need to do to get to net zero within their own value chains. And I think you're right, like that very strict, restrictive system is hampering what could be happening if there was more flexibility in that system. And so, yeah, for me, it's we're a mission-driven organization. We're focused on whatever's going to have the biggest impact at a global level. That's what we do. If SBTI came out tomorrow and said you can use carbon credits for everything, and that would completely sink my program I've been working on for 3 years, that's totally fine by me, because if that means that's what would have the biggest impact, right? But I think what's missing a little bit is yeah, it's great, this pathway to net zero, but we need to have action now and today, and what's going to make that action happen today. Yeah, and I think there's got to be a bit more of market thinking and flexibility in that system.
So I would just jump in, and again, back to the terminology. You know, a science-based target derived from the language of the Paris Agreement, which was set in temperature terms, 1.5 degrees. You know, there was never an implementation plan. There was no architecture. There was no map for translating the NDCs, which were in that temperature language, into the operational language of any market, let alone any engineering projects. So there was a huge gap there, and we're still struggling with that. And so, you know, if you think of the net zero company as a buyer, you know, what would get them to act now? They are acting now, but more now is, I think, to simplify. And the pressure on the VCM to be everything, to be perfect, to be full of integrity, to be cost-effective is unrealistic. It can't be the VCM that's carrying all that water. There has to be some simplification on the part of the standard setters to allow the companies to feel more comfortable taking on an obligation. They don't have a responsibility for Scope 3 other than moral. There's absolutely no legal responsibility that I'm aware of for anyone to take for Scope 3. So why would a company do that? We don't have an answer in corporate terms. Now, the other thing that would get companies, I think, moving more quickly is, again, what Chelsea said. You need political will. You need the people to want this. And partly, why would the people want it? You take a look at the extreme weather events for which there's no insurance. You take a look at the hit that the supply chains are taking for companies for which they can't be reimbursed. You know, these are costs that are hidden, externalities. You know, we've talked about that for 30 years. But the more visible and simple the answers, the more visible the costs and the more simple the answers, the faster we can move. And one thing that I think is very important to remember is we now have a figure of $7 trillion, which is considered to be nature negative by the UNEP. They published that number last year. That's $7 trillion of the GDP. That's about 10% of global GDP. That is absolutely knocking out the pillar of nature, just like as if you were going to knock that pillar out of this room and the ceiling would come down. So we've got to turn that $7 trillion around, plus invest a lot of trillions into nature positive. And that's not going to happen if it's constantly made complex. And every time you try, which was said this morning in the plenary, every time you try, you get criticized because you're off it by 1,000 tons, or because one tree blew down and you didn't have the insurance. You know, I mean, these are things that are amusing for us who kind of know, not amusing, but tantalizing and interesting for us who are on this side of the table or in this side of the business. But if you're trying to use this stuff, it's really impossible. And there's as I said earlier, that momentum that came out of Paris is meeting the headwinds of the legal concerns, of the complexity, of the public being exhausted. You know, we're in a very different world in terms of making this VCM work.
I have a question for John. And first of all, thank you for your work at Vera, because I have been tracking insets and in-value chain reductions since the International Insetting Protocol. I don't know if anybody remembers that in the 2015 timeframe. And we really have needed some guidelines around how to quantify and how to prove those insets within a value chain are occurring, how they're traceable, how they're quantified. And so thanks to Vera for taking that on. And I'm just curious, I know that it's early and people probably haven't had a chance to digest all 133 pages, but there's a lot of interesting references to in-value chain indirect mitigation activities that could qualify towards Scope 3 reductions within SBTI. It remains to be seen what those are, but I would love to get your thoughts on what would make a good framework for that. Could we use, for example, carbon credits from HFC mitigation for a company like Whirlpool to utilize, because it's within the same kind of chain of materials that that company uses? And is the right framework credits? Should we be using methodologies that already exist to quantify these insets? Or is there some other way? By the way, SBTI doesn't use the word inset.
No,
So-
neither do we.
Well, thanks. Okay.
Okay.
I'm clearly operating in the 2015 world with that word, but please, yeah, let me know your thoughts on that.
Yeah. No, we don't use insets because everybody has a different idea of what it is, so that's fine. Yeah, I mean, in terms of SBTI, there's some interesting stuff in there that was a surprise to me, actually. They've backed off a little bit, it seems like, on the full traceability requirements, which is absolutely the way that we were hoping that they would go with this. It's exactly how we're thinking the Scope 3 program will work. But you highlighted a really interesting example where, with the HFC and Whirlpool, that flexibility, and it was what I was hinting at earlier as well, is, you know, how precise do we want to get in terms of how we define these value chains and these claims within these value chains? Does it need to be, you know, I work in ag, or I have worked in ag, so that's where I always go to for my analogies, but do we need to have, you know, direct traceability between the actual farm, the field on that farm, and what the company buying that grain of wheat from that exact field on that farm can claim? Or can we consider wheat, you know, in a broader sort of regional context of all the wheat kind of produced in this area? In the Scope 3 program, we're trying to build in that flexibility by defining a product in a more broader sense, so that companies can then make a claim based on, yeah, I source wheat in my supply chain from the US, then maybe I can make a claim on that wheat. Because that's the sort of degree of flexibility I think we need to enable these market-based systems and enable more flexibility and more, I think you said efficient use of capital. It's a great term. So that's great to see in the SBTI Net Zero version 2. I think we would also like to see them go a bit further in terms of, because you mentioned methodologies as well, using or allowing some form of project-based accounting. So that's probably where you're going with your insetting term, but and there is hints of that. They talk about projects, they talk about interventions. This is a really key piece for me, is that companies think about projects, they think about interventions, but they think about assets and risks, and that's how companies make decisions. And inventory accounting really doesn't lend itself to that. Inventory accounting is really just a liability. You quantify your emissions, and that's what you're responsible for. It doesn't really get to how do you address those emissions through projects and creation of assets that have value. So that's really the basis of the Scope 3 standard program. Is we focus on the projects, we focus on the things that have the real impact. We try and create an asset that has value, and companies can start to think about that in the same way that they think about you know, commercial commodities and making decisions as a business. I don't know if Paula, maybe you have an insight on that. Or
No, I insets, outsets.
Okay.
No, I don't have a comment, other than, again, you know, it becomes very difficult to, you know, a ton is a ton is a ton. And if you think of the atmosphere as your client, you know, the atmosphere doesn't care really about some of this. So we just have to kind of
Absolutely.
simplify.
Thank you. I realize that it's ironic there is a Scope 3 session occurring right now, but obviously all of these topics are intertwined and they all influence each other, so it's difficult to just tease it out without, you know, talking about the elephant in the room, the 90% or more of emissions from each company coming from Scope 3, which is what McKinsey estimates. Thanks, John, for that. I am curious, we've talked a lot about SBTI, and they do comprise the majority of the global economy. If you look at the about 10,000 companies that have set targets under it, and then the influence that those companies have on their supply chain. But I am curious to hear about maybe an alternative. I mean, let's think creatively here. And in saying that, I would love to also get your thoughts on VCMI, which is not a guideline per se, but we mentioned it earlier. It's meant to be a way to make credible claims. It was an initiative to allow corporates to make credible claims related to credit purchases. And that falls into 3 categories: silver, gold, or platinum, based on the number of credits that you purchase. And that was really as a reaction to some of the lawsuits around carbon neutrality claims. And so I am curious, could VCMI be a driver for companies to take action, knowing that VCMI is at this point really paired to SBTI? In order to even make those claims, they have to be SBTI compliant. Or are there other alternatives? We for a while were looking at the ISO standard as possibly a net zero alternative to SBTI. It looks like it's more or less a carbon copy of it at this point. But I would love to hear your thoughts on, has the train left the station? Does SBTI have too much momentum to be stopped? Or do you think there is a way by which perhaps there could be other guidelines that are more tenable for corporates to follow and would allow participation of oil and gas and other large industry that we clearly want to bring into the fold for reductions and greenhouse gas commitments?
Maybe I'll jump in, and I'll definitely let my fellow panelists opine on VCMI. But I think it's important to reflect on the fact that corporate leadership is happening. It's great if there's a guideline or guidance that is widely adopted and accepted and it works for everyone, like, this wonderful future state, and very much encouraged to see as guidelines move towards a more sort of market-friendly interpretation, because again, of the points I've made earlier today. But I think we can't discount the fact that corporates are moving ahead. Like, they are setting their own systems and frameworks and methods for meeting their targets, and they're not waiting, I'm not suggesting that every corporate is doing this, but certainly there's some that are waiting for guidance. But I do think that there's a lot of corporate action that's being taken and a lot of planning and work that's being done behind the scenes about how to effectively execute on the targets that are being set. Because again, I go back to, in absence of action, we're really quickly marching towards 2030, and then you're going to ultimately have to abandon a target if you're not going to meet a target, or you're going to have to revise it, and what does that mean, and is that palatable? So there's a lot of action, I think, and considerations that are being taken. We're seeing, consortiums that are coming in from a buying perspective. We're seeing organizations that have ultimately been removed from SBTI, that are some of the largest buyers in the market, that are making announcements every day about the types of investments they're making. And candidly speaking, I mean, the last two, I think, largest transaction retirements that have been happening in the VCM has been energy companies. So, there's still a lot of action that's happening. And again, I go back to, if you look at retirement data, we're really scratching at the surface versus all the organizations that have made commitments to emission reduction targets and net zero. So we're at we're just at the starting gate here. So I think the alternative is that in absence of clarity or standards that are pragmatic that can be executed effectively across industry, there is action still happening, and there is organizations that are doing that planning and executing on that planning themselves. So I think it's good to look at what are those large companies doing, how are they thinking about it, and again, not every sector. You can't compare the tech sector to energy, but you can look at like for like and see what these different industries are doing. And certainly if you go to industry level conferences, in some of these very energy intensive, emissions intensive industries, they're not saying we're getting rid of these targets. They're continuing to march forward. And so that's exciting.
Yeah, I agree with that, but on the other hand, there's got to be some standardization and simplification, as I keep saying. So the VCMI was really also a counterpoint in a way to the Integrity Council. Integrity Council. I don't know how they talk about messaging. You can't really tell the two apart, but one is supply, one is demand. And again, for you who are in the room dealing with all these projects, again, you have to be able to sell a product to somebody who wants to buy it because they're meeting their targets. Even if the companies are using their own system, they will say, we have decided to use our own system, but we're deferring to Vera, and we're using 2 or 3, or this morning I heard somebody say they had to go through 13 different rubrics to have a synthesized report that they thought was board ready. And that's untenable, and they won't keep doing this. Companies won't keep doing this. So the burden again falls on the market itself to both simplify, guarantee integrity, and keep the prices palatable. And so that last bit, I think to get a higher price, ultimately the VCM has to become more integrated with a standardized system, which is the mandatory markets. And somehow they also need to be injected with, some openness more to the offset product. To have everything being rejected all the time. If you look at the African continent where they're generating all kinds of projects, many of which are high quality potentially, and they can't sell them into a mandatory market for 30 or 40 or 100 euros a ton. They have to sell them for $2, $3, $4 a ton to a company that's willing to buy them. And, that's not tenable for Africa. So the issue of quality and price and standardization should not become the burden of the VCM itself. There's got to be some kind of standardization that also allows companies the flexibility that they need. And, to the earlier question, cost-effective, least cost emissions reductions first. That's the principle of a carbon market, cap and trade. Can't be, net zero definitely can't be achieved without some form of carbon credit, to your earlier question, and then take the bigger cosmic thing of 30 by 30. 30% of the world's ocean and land resources are being called upon to be off limits by 2030, or they will be lost and the whole planet will be spoiled. Forget about climate change, just ecosystem spoilage. Who is going to take 30% of the land that they own off limits to exploitation and use without being remunerated somehow? Nobody. So the carbon price, the VCM, all of this arguing about standards has an ultimate goal, which is to protect 30% of the planet's resources. Back to what I said earlier. So we do have to find an answer to this. And, I don't think it's wise to anoint one particular standard, but I think we need to have enough standardization, industry-led, to make sense to the buyers. And ultimately, back to, the Paris Agreement. SBTI was a child of the Paris Agreement, but it may be that using the temperature gauge as the guidance is just not operationally feasible for companies at this point.
I completely agree with you that the moving forward with standards is incredibly important, but I do think it's great to see action we don't want to be waiting like a deer in the headlights for a standard to give the answer and not take action. So it needs to be happening in conjunction.
Right.
We need to continue to progress, and I think that's why pointing to corporate entities that are participating and kind of celebrating that participation as opposed to villainizing it is really important to be able to draw others into it, and then also to continue to progress. Because again, we want to see the standardization, but we don't have the time to wait for the silver bullet to come necessarily.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to pose a question to Chelsea, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say you've both hit on two interesting points there, I think. One is you need a pathway to make a claim, right? Like but ultimately what a company needs to do or needs to see is I'm going to make this investment and get something from it, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a really important thing. Like the net zero target obviously is 2050, but it's kind of a long way away. But 2030 is not long away for the interim targets, and companies are not seeing that pathway. And so definitely we're seeing companies. In my engagement, I've heard of companies having multiple $1 billion ready to spend, but they can't spend it because they can't go to their C-suite and say, we spent this money, but we can't make a claim from it, so it's kind of gone, right? Like, so so that's I think for me that's the thing that we really need to sort out. Whether that's SBTI or whether that's somebody else, I think we're agnostic as a mission-driven organization. Whatever is the thing that makes that action happen now and removes that barrier. I think the SBTI net zero standard does go some way to opening that door. So I was very excited to see that, but could definitely go a bit further.
The one thing I would throw out is, and this is maybe something for questions later, but the Commodities Future and Trading Commission in the United States had a guidance that would have been very helpful to, quote, standardization and overseeing of the, carbon market. And that guidance was approved and was on the books, and now a resolution has been floated in the Congress to nullify that rule. And, that's a big step backward, because in my opinion, if the VCM could be monitored as if, which it is, a commodity by the CFTC, that would be a real stamp of approval. That would be, an immediate way for buyers and sellers to understand that they were within the rubric of a governmental organization while still allowing companies to be as flexible as they need to be. And so I think that's a significant step back and maybe something to watch for, because it might require some lobbying to restore the CFTC guidance. And there's only upside for the economy to have that.
I think that's a really great point. Thanks for bringing up the CFTC. I do want to go back to something Chelsea said, which is that she's still seeing retirements, she's still seeing activity, and that we are as well at Anew. And what we've really seen is there are some large buyers, like the Microsofts and the JP Morgans, who are not SBTI members, and they may have left the Net Zero Banking Alliance, but they are moving forward with purchases and with action. And they're being very discerning about what they buy, and they are in those two instances purchasing removals. And it's interesting to see that some companies are moving ahead with conviction, and they may not be following guidelines, but they have their own internal set of what they deem to be a mark of quality, and they feel confident, and they're moving forward, and you don't see them getting criticized for doing that. I think it is more challenging for smaller companies to do that may not have a 20-person plus removals team to vet projects and may not have as much clout. But I do think it's interesting that there are still the corporates that have their own internal guidance, and they're moving forward, and they're moving forward with conviction with large purchases. And so I do want to make sure that's known. I think it's been a fascinating trend. Chelsea brought up coalitions, but just to see this evolution of Symbiosis, Frontier Alliance, these are buyers' coalitions, if you're unfamiliar with them. And they're trying to simplify the process of identifying and procuring high-quality removals or other types of credits. And so I feel like that's an interesting development, as some corporates maybe want to be a part of a coalition. They don't have the resources to do the vetting of the projects, and then they're joining into these perhaps for safe harbor too, because the coalition said it's okay, we're going to move forward and believe in that. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the evolution of those coalitions and any other type of movement that you may see that provides safe harbor for buyers in this uncertain environment.
I think that, like, when you think about socializing the cost, so execution of the strategy, development of the strategy, execution of the strategy, obviously there's complexities that come when you're working as a coalition versus just an individual organization that's making decisions. So you have to effectively get to the same framework of what you want to execute on and have that alignment and agreement. But you do get to socialize the cost of that execution. You do get the benefit of, again, well, we've all agreed that this is a good project, so I guess we're all going to get criticized or we're all not going to get criticized. So that there's that benefit. And I think actually, depending on the composition of the coalition, it can be really beneficial, because think about if you had one member participant from a variety of different sectors that each have their own operational and technical expertise, then you can actually socialize that expertise amongst the coalition to make an effective execution strategy. You don't need to say, okay, to understand this project type, I need to go out and find the expert here, because maybe the member of the coalition has a ton of experience here. And then when we go in this direction, because we want to, again, have a diversified portfolio, think about it as just like portfolio theory, you don't want to have all of your eggs in one basket, it allows you to socialize that expertise across the coalition. So I think it's actually a really interesting and, seems to be quite effective model for use. So, yeah, more is better.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that. I mean, safety in numbers kind of thing. But again, turnover is very important in this conversation. Turnover of leadership in the companies, turnover in leadership in the groups, and the Net Zero, Asset Managers Alliance, it's kind of been around a while. And people, people have only so much energy. So a lot of these coalitions, again, were born in the post-Paris enthusiasm and, gave power in numbers. And some of them probably have outlived their usefulness. And we probably need to rethink, again, this idea of safe harbor going forward and maintaining the flexibility. But I think on balance, it's good to be in a group. And particularly, so there's 13 rubrics. Okay, so everybody must, 3 out of the 13 are probably held in common by everybody. So, you can kind of get a comfort from being in a club, a coalition of the willing, a club that everybody has to be a member of.
That's a great point. We mean business. We're definitely in the wake of the Paris Agreement. And now, where are they now, right? We are now facing kind of, headwinds, and it is interesting. Is there a role to bind together again?
Well, and I think, one of the other things that's really important to mention is if you look at some of the coalitions, they're specifically focused on long-duration removals projects. The likelihood of having access in the spot market to long-duration removals is a tricky one because these projects are extraordinarily expensive, and so the participation of the coalition in terms of taking an offtake, whether they're doing prepayment structures, et cetera, in order to get these projects actually built, and then the time frame that they're gonna deliver in, means that those credits might just be gone. So they're making that investment, the project starts delivering, I can't remember Frontier's exact time frame, 2027 to 2030, something along those lines. You don't have access to those projects because that coalition just bought the projects. And so the benefit of that is that they're pooling resources as well, because these projects, if you want long duration removals, is not some like, oh, I can make this small investment and I'm gonna suddenly have access to this. In absence of doing that, is there gonna be even spot market availability of those credits? That might be unlikely. And so it's, what does that overarching strategy look like? And then I think it's important again to look at the sector, because in certain sectors it might make sense for all of their purchases to be removals. In other sectors it's, you can look at things like the Oxford Principles, which blends reductions and removals together. It looks at short-term all the way through to long-term removals, but you're thinking about it from a pragmatic lens, like what is the cost on a per-ton basis that my organization can bear, depending on the sector I'm in. And so I think there's like a lot of strategies that need to come together, and like for like that you need to have that comparability of strategy, but there is the benefit of being able to pool resources. And then I'm pretty sure with some of those coalitions, the individual companies will buy outside of the coalition too. So it doesn't preclude them from doing things individually, but it does give them that action that they can do together. But, for certain credit types, I really want to emphasize, like, it's not that you can say, okay, you know what, I've got it all figured out. My strategy's baked. Tomorrow I'm going to go in the market, I'm going to press a button, and it's going to come into my account. We're talking about things that take multiple years to execute on. We're talking about individual bilateral negotiations. We're talking about the fact that there's no standard form of agreement, so you're individually negotiating a contract. So it's really important to take, steps towards that, because this does take time.
Can I just come in as well? Yeah, so it's an interesting, I hadn't really thought about the safety in numbers thing. We're a certification body, so certification for us is part of that safeguarding and giving companies the confidence to make an investment. But this is also why I'm a big fan of scope 3 emissions accounting, because the huge advantage is that everybody in the supply chain shares the same emissions, right? That's how scope 3 emissions accounting works with nested emissions. And so with our program, we're trying to facilitate, flip that and say, actually, you all get to share the benefits of making an intervention or reducing those emissions in that common supply chain or value chain. And so we're trying to develop that in our program through a registry, a transparent registry, with having, being able to sort of do some matchmaking between buyers that can then share those costs within a value chain. So, but I hadn't thought of the safety in numbers part of that too, so thanks.
Who pays for the scope 3 emissions is a really interesting question for me that we won't solve here. But we have about 8 minutes left, and I want to open it up to the audience for questions. So get your questions formulated. But as you're doing that, I want to just make a pitch that the SBTI Net Zero Standard 2 is in a comment period. And if you haven't already thought through maybe some comments that you want to submit on behalf of your organization or yourself, I would encourage you to do that, because we're in a really critical time. I think it goes for 75 days. And so keep that in mind. All right.
Good point.
See if the mic can get passed around, or maybe there is no mic. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Everett Salas with Chevron. A lot of the comments I'm hearing today actually I find very encouraging, so thank you. One thing I'm curious about, I'm trying to synthesize a lot of what I heard, is with respect to the accounting and the price discovery for carbon, right, and sort of like this incentivization, is there an opportunity to actually rethink the way we're doing the current accounting? because currently it's very static, right? It doesn't really allow for any kind of stocks, flows, like recognition that emissions move through supply chains. So if we were to start thinking more about products, right, and differentiating products, that to me seems like you would start to get into the realm of competitiveness, right? And now you're competing on carbon, trying to understand what is that, if you're differentiating these products, what is that differentiation worth to a customer? What are they willing to pay for it, right? And now, as somebody who's on a strategy team, if I know what that signal is, I can start building a business plan, I can start sharing I can start making a business case that has a payback period, that has a return, that I can start sharing with leadership, right? And that all of a sudden takes the credits away from being this thing that it's in my marketing group, it's in my sustainability team, that's really good. They're doing that for, making claims that they can say we're doing something right, we're being good stewards, and it moves it into we're actually being competitive and we're competing on being the lowest carbon, the lowest provider of this particular product, right? And getting a sense for what the market actually thinks that price should be.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the point of the Scope 3 program, really, is to take what we have in the VCM, adapt it a little bit and tweak it here and there where it needs to be, but also attribute those emissions data to a product, right? And so we create a market for these products that have lower emissions footprints associated with them, or maybe even removals associated with them. And that's also the point of making the registry transparent as well about, and you play this out, hopefully that creates a market for that product. It might not be that physical product. I think this is where a lot of this falls down, is that right now the rules say you have to have that physical product in your supply chain. But if it's an equivalent product, and you can buy the emissions attribute associated with an equivalent product, but it might not be that physical product, there might be various barriers to that. It might just be that the supply chain is very volatile and complex, and it's just impossible to track where that actual product goes. So those are some of the things we're trying to figure out in our program, where that line is. But definitely, I agree with you, like creating markets for these products is a great way to get that investment and get that action going and create some competition.
Bob?
Yeah, picking up on a point you mentioned, Paula mentioned simplification, and Lizzie, you sort of asked earlier, are we married to SBTI? And I was thinking this morning what Craig said about Scope 3, and just sitting here. If this is really supposed to be about financing activities that fight climate change, and no offense to all, and I'm one of the consultants in the room, not full employment for consultants to measure Scope 3 emissions. Wouldn't it make more sense if we could have a simple standard, net zero, Scope 1? You measure Scope 1, you do what you can to lower it, you then buy eligible offsets, check that box. Net zero Scope 2, measure electricity use, buy RECs or offsets, public RECs, check the box. And if everybody did that, obviously everyone, Scope 3 is someone's Scope 1 or 2. And maybe when it comes to Scope 3, you would just ask corporate to say, you have to ask your supply chain, have you measured your Scope 1 or 2? It's a yes or no. And we just hold organizations directly accountable for Scope 1 and 2, which they can control. And let's put the money there and get into those climate actions. Because we've got a whole bunch of companies who've made commitments and haven't done crap on their Scope 1 or 2, or done very little. I mean, some of these have. I don't know, I'm just sort of
I do.
throwing the simplification. Maybe
I do like the check boxes. It's kind of like the LEED certification.
Well,
Do you
yeah,
have
and
a
maybe
bike rack?
that's
Do you
not
have
my
a shower?
background, 'cause I helped write the LEED standard. It's like
It's like, here are the ways to go about doing it. Well, there's, buildings have a lot of variability, but I would probably argue that companies under that have so much more. It would be difficult to have a discrete list. But I like your thinking. I do wonder if, leaving out Scope 3 altogether, it suddenly does limit. Certainly Scope 1 and 2, we do need action there. But you would likely not have participation if it's just, do you report your Scope 1 and 2, or do you, but if there was a requirement that you reduce.
You have to do a 100% offset on 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Buy RECs, buy offsets.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, your logic logic is sound if you had full coverage of the market, right? So in NDCs, like that works because the majority of countries have signed up to NDCs, and you can have like this full accounting system. But in the private sector, voluntary private sector, that's not necessarily the case. I'm going to use another ag analogy. I apologize, but a farmer is not going to care about his scope 1 and 2 emissions, and also doesn't have the resources often to act on those scope 1 and 2 emissions. So the purpose of scope 3, or one of the advantages of scope 3, is that the corporates that do have the resources to help and act, it causes those companies to filter those resources down to those hotspots in their value chain, where those individuals cannot necessarily don't have the resources to impact their own scope 1 and 2. So I think logically it's sound, but I think it's more like a coverage kind of issue.
It'd be great if all those companies would step up and make scope 1 and 2 commitments too, but the reality is we're kind of far from there. But I do agree that, hey, let's take some action on scope 1 and 2 at a minimum, and that's not happening. It is now time to thank the panel, and if you have any final thoughts, you're welcome to have 10 seconds each, and then we'll thank you and wrap it up. Any final thoughts?
Well, thank you, first of all. Thanks for having us. I think it's exciting the way that SBTI is relaxing some of its rules. I think we've got to stick with what we've got. We don't have a lot of time to reinvent the wheel. So, let's try and make what we've got work, agnostic as to how that is. But simplification is definitely needed as well. So anyway, these are all things we're trying to do in our Scope 3 program, so I'm just going to plug that again. But I think those are all things, and hopefully we're going to end up in the right place eventually.
So in my 10 seconds, all I'm going to say also is thank you to Lizzie for being an excellent moderator, but also, again, to all of you in the room, because obviously you're here because you're committed to the issue. It is not easy what you're doing. It takes a lot of stamina, a lot of risk embracing, and, but I do believe that it's the most important thing you could be doing in the environmental movement right now.
Perfect. Well, I'll end with just kind of a visualization. So I always like to think about participation as we're marching towards these quickly approaching 2030 deadlines. Have you ever seen 5-year-olds play soccer? If you haven't, it's very cute. You have a whole gaggle of children that are all running at the ball at the exact same period of time. And I always say, let's not be 5-year-olds playing soccer, because we don't all want to be chasing the ball in 2029 trying to do the exact same thing at the exact same moment in time because there's only one ball. We really need to be taking the steps forward today because these things do take multiple years. And so I am excited to see the action that's being taken, but I would encourage dip your toe in, start to take the baby steps, start to capacity build if it's something you haven't started yet, because ultimately we're going to be there before we know it, and we don't want to be the 5-year-olds chasing the soccer ball.
That was a great end. Let's thank our panelists.
Thank you, that was great. Good to be with you. Not to be